This is the first in what will hopefully be a series of quote-unquote podcasts trying to address some issues related to Marxism or related to communism. It's not something that I plan to do too frequently. It's also not something that I plan to try and make a living at or anything of that nature. I should make everyone aware that I am not a professional podcaster. I'm not someone who is trained in public speaking or communications or broadcasting or anything of that sorts. Chances are I am going to use many stall words. I may say for a very long time. I may take pauses, lots of pauses to think about what I'm saying, and I may make many mistakes. I would suspect that for the most part, this is hopefully going to remain as I would speak in conversation, if not a little bit more subdued. I tend to get pretty excited in conversation, and I'll oftentimes talk pretty rapidly and make a lot of assumptions about who I'm talking with. I think not facing someone in particular will give me the capacity to sort of slow that down a little bit. And if you're anything like me, maybe you're one of those people who likes to fall asleep to some spoken word. So maybe I'll be able to provide the subscribers and readers of CapitalismVSocialism with some sleeping material. And hopefully that will mean that these are not boring, or if they are boring, that they're boring in a comfortable and desirable way. So, what are we here for? This is the first, again, in a series, and we're starting off with what questions do you have with respect to Marxism? So, as many of you know, I posted this, looks like now about 4 hours ago. That may be actually a little bit old. Let me reload this page here. No, it still says 4 hours ago, but who knows if that's 4 hours, 45 minutes, or I have no idea how Reddit rounds its hours or anything of that sorts. So I received a number of questions in this thread. Not to get into the general politics and machinations of capitalism v socialism, the majority of questions are really disheartening. So we have a lot of loaded questions. I used the term leading questions when I had responded to one of them, which is not exactly accurate. The leading question, I guess, is more of a with respect to court testimony or, someone being a witness in a judicial proceeding. Loaded question, although a leading question is a form of a loaded question. So why are we God? That is you, why are we God, the user. Or no, actually, yeah, so you, why are we God was corrected me on that and said, yes, it's a loaded question, and that's true. It is a loaded question, which he asked, or they asked, I should say. Why didn't Marx realize true communism could only be set up using nonviolence? And I really don't want to answer questions that make these big assumptions, partly because I don't want to go on forever and ever. And I don't, it's like if you want to challenge me or if you want to challenge Marx's position on the question of violence or the use of violence, then it's like just do so directly. Why try to cloak it in this ridiculous question that sort of just embeds your assumption and then forces someone like myself to consider that assumption in trying to answer your question? Short answer is I'm not going to do it. Similarly, I'm not going to answer end to feds, which is why can't Marxists agree on having similar definitions? I think by and large Marxists do agree on the definitions that they use. I think there's maybe a little bit of difficulty just in terms of being on the internet compared to running in Marxist circles in perhaps a place where people are a little bit more accountable because they're not completely anonymous. So those are two loaded questions that make assumptions, and I'm just going to reject the assumptions. In fact, I'll say I'm just going to reject the assumptions even if I maybe would be willing to entertain those assumptions or at least expand on why they should be rejected. So in the case of why didn't Marx realize true communism could only be set up using nonviolence, I will simply say because that's not the case. True communism could be set up using violence. And in the question of why can't Marxists agree on having similar definitions, I will simply answer that they do. And there's actually a few more in terms of the loaded questions category. Why is Engels and his views constantly being ignored? So we'll answer that one similarly and just say that they're not. Engels' views are not constantly being ignored. Ignored by whom, anyway? There's a few other questions in here that I would like to address before I get to sort of the main question that we're actually going to address in more detail. And this one's not so much a question, but Diamond Wolf says, I've been looking for a chapter-by-chapter breakdown of Das Kapital that includes modern applications as well as tidbits of historical relevance. I asked what modern applications meant, and they said that they should probably have simply phrased modern and historical relevance. I think that Capital is one of those books that has an extreme amount of modern relevance. It may require a full reading and then a sort of reflection on what that actually means with respect to society. But I think the evidence that Marx's analysis is correct is really almost undeniable. I mean, I think it's just clearly visible when you look out into society, particularly on the antagonism between use value and exchange value, and the sort of over commodification of everything in our society, and the way that we see really how markets have expanded and how markets have dissipated. I shouldn't say dissipated in terms of the market still existing, but how the mode of production has changed within certain industries, and how it's starting to advance and be superseded based on material conditions. And what I mean by that, more specifically, if the common example that I constantly raise is open source software. But I think we're starting to see that more and more now in at least lightweight or sort of widget manufacturing with the level of 3D printers. I think that's going to be a pretty massive shift in how relations of production begin to change over time. So we're seeing it in the most advanced areas of technological development, in the area where the material conditions are most advanced. And I don't think that is a coincidence. I think that's very indicative of Marx's foresight on the issue. And the use value, obviously, of open source software contrasted to the exchange value is quite clear. I mean, I use Linux on all. I'm recording this podcast right now on Linux. In terms of server space, in terms of the supercomputer farms that are out there, in terms of video editing and movie production, and there are so many spaces where open source software has demonstrated equivalent use value to essentially every single piece of commercial software. Now, there are spaces where open source software doesn't do that, where it doesn't have equivalent features, or doesn't provide as many very specific features as some things. I'm thinking, like, in terms of image editing, I know at least, GIMP has historically provided a significant set of features, but for the longest time, and I think still doesn't have CMYK support, which has really held it off from being used in print designs. But I've used Inkscape for flyer designs. Anyway, so I think Diamond Wolf's question or comment is well taken. But to me, this is just a massive undertaking. David Harvey does, if not a chapter by chapter, perhaps even a section by section breakdown I'm not a huge fan of Harvey's interpretation, but overall, I think there's a lot that can be gained from listening to different perspectives and different interpretations on Marx and Marx's work. So I would encourage anyone to look into that. I don't think he does anything with, although I think it's probably true that he does cover how this relates to the real world in some way. I think any good teacher would do that naturally. But this is just a massive undertaking that is not something that I can do, certainly not in response to this one sort of off-the-cuff post where I was asking for questions to be answered, what I envisioned as being answered today, as I'm recording this now on the same day. The only other question that I had that seemed reasonable to answer, aside from the main question, at least at the time of this, I guess there's actually one more, but Nonpartisan Moron actually said, what are the main focuses of contemporary Marxists? And that again is just, it's a really weird question to me. I think it's an okay question to entertain, but it's a really weird question just in that, contemporary Marxists is a very broad group. There's contemporary Marxist economists. There are your sort of regular, everyday Marxists like myself. I'm not an economist, or at least I'm not a professionally trained or recognized economist. I don't write papers on economics. I don't do any sort of formal research within economics. I'm just a web developer or software engineer / server administrator who happens to be a Marxist because of my history with Marx, with reading Marx, and I think with seeing how Marx's insights sort of described certain aspects of the system that I saw around me. So what is my main focus? Well, that also assumes, I assume you're asking my main focus with respect to Marx. And my main focus with respect to Marx is really trying to understand Marx holistically. There's a lot of accusations of inconsistency. There's a lot of accusations of, and I think a lot of things get reduced. There's this whole debate on personal property and private property, and what was Marx's conception on personal property. And I think the reduction of property down to personal and private is the first mistake. I think this is just holdover from Proudhon that we're not getting past. So one of my main focuses is developing a holistic interpretation that does not separate Marx out into these sort of component pieces. Because I think one of the major things where Marx differs from other people who may have assessed economics or even questions of justice. If you look at Adam Smith, obviously classical economist, there's a lot that one could say about sort of his sociological or even psychological analysis within The Wealth of Nations, but also within Theory of Moral Sentiment. It's not, I think Marx, more than Smith or more than almost any other thinker, has a worldview where one aspect of his thinking is so heavily intertwined or influenced with other aspects of his thinking that I don't think you can easily parse him out and separate him, where I think you can do that with other thinkers. So that's my main focus. Other people like Kleiman, Anwar Sheikh, I think, who I would call a Marxist. I think there's some debate there as to whether or not Anwar Sheikh is a Marxist, but I think to me it's patently obvious. But so within the economics field, though, obviously Marxist economists are concerned primarily with developing Marxist economic analysis. And whether that's Kleiman, who really attempts to, in my view, recover the labor theory of value, or someone like Sheikh, who I think is more aptly described as, in some ways, carrying on the legacy of Marx, more than, which is maybe a little bit different from what most people would call a Marxist. I think what Anwar Sheikh is trying to do, and maybe he's done successfully. I haven't read his complete book. I've watched a lot of videos and I've read pieces, bits and pieces from the book. But what he's really trying to do is piece together a view of capitalism and a view of the modern political economy that is really rooted as much in the material realities of that system as anything else. He starts from a very non-idealized form of economics, and his thinking, if I understand correctly, is that you don't need to necessarily even abstract the way that Marx did, but that you can put together a wholly consistent system with these sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? Interacting pieces or components of that system. And it may be a messy model, or what people might consider an undesirable model. But in his view, it's an accurate model. Essentially what he's saying is reality is not idealized, so our model shouldn't be idealized, or even in that sense really abstracted too heavily. And it's wholly possible in his view to sort of model out the economy in very complete terms without having to rely on that. So I think we're coming up on maybe about 20 minutes here, maybe a little bit between 15 and 20 minutes. So that's a lot of preamble as to what this podcast is, what the questions I received are. So I'm going to hopefully get into the main question now without taking much more than the same amount of time I've taken on all this other stuff to answer this question. The primary question that I received on this comment thread that I want to address was posted by Namesroo. And Namesroo actually asked a number of questions within the comment, and maybe I'll get on to addressing some of them after I address the primary one. But the first one is, where specifically does Marx elaborate and formalize his definition of private property as a social relation? I went digging through his quotes on property, hoping to find a specific chapter in Capital or essay where he lays it out wholly and clearly, but I couldn't find any text where he does that. There doesn't seem to be any easily accessible consolidation of Marx's thoughts on this matter from himself or anyone else, other than a doctoral thesis I found. And I think that's pretty accurate in terms of the commentary after the question. There's no single work, ironically, that Marx produced addressing the question of property generally, or private property as it exists in capitalism and bourgeois society. The brunt of Marx's comments on property are essentially scattered throughout his work. So there are a few comments made in Poverty of Philosophy. Obviously, there are statements made in Capital. I actually think his clearest elucidation still is within the manifesto, only because I think it is concise, and although I think there's a lot there to unpack, and I've had many debates surrounding it, I do think it is one of the most complete expressions of his property, or concept of property. So that said, the doctoral thesis which you mention, which I assume is the same doctoral thesis that I've read, is a doctoral thesis simply titled Marx on Property from Thomas William Keyes. If that's not the thesis that you're referring to, then it would be great to see whatever you're referring to, but I don't know how many doctoral theses there are. The thesis is described as a dissertation submitted to the faculty of the graduate school Marquette University in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy. Again, it's Thomas William Keyes. This is July 1981 out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I think this paper in particular actually is it's certainly the most concise explanation or exposition on Marx's views of property. It relies heavily on quotes from Marx. It does include a significant number of citations and references with respect to Marx's views. And I think it's generally well put together. There are points that I would contest that are made within it. I think there's an over-reliance on examining the base versus superstructure distinction. I think overwhelmingly when Marx referred to property, specifically when he referred to private property, he is referring to what we see revealed in the superstructure. And that is really what our concern is when we're talking about social relations, or property as a social relation. With that said, I'm going to rely on really only a single quote from this doctoral thesis to make the case with respect to Marx's view of property as a social relation. I don't think it's necessary to really make the case that Marx viewed property as a social relation. I think that's apparent from the numerous quotes, despite how dispersed they are throughout his work. It's pretty clear that Marx believed this to be the case. I don't think there's any argument to be had that Marx believed property to be a relation specifically between person and object, independent of society. And I don't think it's the case that he ever really referred to property as the thing itself. Certainly, the extent to which we have accepted the property relations and the normalization of bourgeois property relations, we now essentially refer to any title ownership as private property. And I've said repeatedly on a number of occasions that private property is better phrased as title ownership for a little bit of a reason, because I think it is important to point out that the concern for private property is the social relation. And although it may seem a little bit backwards, title property, or referring to private property as title property, does expose the social relationship that's there, because there essentially is none. What I mean by that is there's no sort of communal relationship. There's no social relationship in terms of, if one were to talk social versus antisocial, right? It's essentially an agnostic relationship in terms of social relations. So it's not like familial property, right? Or communal property on a commune. Nor is it like the communal property of the commons or the public properties of earlier feudal societies. Nor is it like crown property or property that was recognized through divine right. Nor was it like the property of feudal lords, which was steeped in the various responsibilities, reciprocal responsibilities for that matter, that lords would have to vassals and serfs. It was not as one way as is often portrayed. So there's a difference when we talk about title property. We're actually exposing the fact that the social relation has been reduced to one of almost pure legal question, right? It's purely clinical in a sense, right? It's devoid of any actual social relation, and it becomes purely a mechanism of social power, a way to say that I can forcefully exclude you from this. It doesn't rely on you having any other particular social relation to a person. And therefore, it creates its own unique set of social relations that are extremely crude and impersonal. And this is a problem that Marx had with it, obviously. But it's a good way to contrast it to earlier forms of property. So really, the main issue that I want to get to here is not whether or not Marx viewed private property as a social relation or property in general as social relations, but why? And I want to focus on simply the question of, can you imagine a world where private property is disconnected from the social relation? And what we have to analyze when we think about this is what Marx really called relations of production. Relations of production are all the relationships that we enter into as humans when we produce things. And these relations of production are dependent on the material conditions and the development of the material forces that we use in the process of production. So, for example, how I relate to people in a society where material development is relatively limited, or limited by comparison to current material development, is going to be very different than how I relate to other people within an office building, right? Even within our current society, how coal miners may relate to their bosses or even to one another in the act of production is very different than how someone like myself, a web developer / software engineer, relates to their bosses. And the reason for this is pretty simple. Because certain material conditions apply, the way that we produce certain things, or the mechanisms by which we produce certain things, requires different relations. So for coal miners, or anyone working a significantly dangerous profession, their relationship to a boss is not simply a matter of do I get food for a week, right? It's, do I get killed today? Does the mine explode? If you don't provide the requisite safety precautions, if you don't provide the requisite regulation on or safety measures that we take as laborers, if you don't provide enough people, if you don't provide the means to secure the mine, there's all these circumstances which make that relationship very different depending on material reality. You can compare this to, or hypothetically think about it, if coal mining was done from a computer, right? If the technology existed, and actually it probably does exist, but generally speaking, it's because of the position of coal in the economy as a whole, it's not going to be reasonably productive to invest this much capital. But imagine, for example, that coal mining was predominantly a function of going into an office and commanding a drone from a computer. And coal miners, rather than being these hard physical laborers that have to get into a mine, every day they go into an office and they sit in front of a computer and they mine these little drones and robots, and those guys go down into the mine and essentially do all the work, whether that's actually drilling, planting explosives, whatever they need to do, right? And there's no threat to their lives. The safety precautions that they're primarily concerned with are making sure that there's a sign up if there's water on the kitchen floor so they don't slip. And the relations of production in this sense begin to change in a very specific way, right? We're not talking about in a very generalized way, which we'll get to in a moment, but in a very specific way, how they relate to their bosses and how their bosses relate to the capital investors becomes very different, right? even what they're asking for becomes very different. So it's no longer a matter of this is life and death. And that results in different demands. It results in different tactics for demands and different styles for demands. I think that's one of the reasons we don't see labor strikes in the sense that we used to. And I think a lot of people, they go, oh, well, this means capitalism is getting better and capitalism is becoming nicer, so to speak, right? Is that we're no longer threatening people's lives on a day-to-day basis within the actual act of production, and we're making jobs less dangerous and all this stuff. And I think that's true to an extent, but I think it's sort of like it's a sort of dodge of the overall problem here. But the question comes into play is, what is property if not that sort of master social relation, right? And what I mean by this is when we talk about having to beg for the means to secure a mine, or even having to beg for a particular piece of software to be able to perform your job better, or more easily, or less stressfully, or in a way that isn't going to drive you insane. This is consistently an appeal to the ownership class for those resources. And it's because we don't have the control over those resources or the social relations among producers directly, right? So it would be a very different example. And, I referenced open source software earlier, which has really changed this if you think about it. But it's a very different circumstance to live in, where instead of appealing to a single person for some quantity of abstract wealth in order to buy or purchase the things that you need, you are appealing to a broad community, or maybe not even appealing to them, but that you share things cooperatively and directly, so it's not even an appeal, it's just readily available, right? This almost demonstrates how social relations and property are a tautology, right? The entire relationship between the worker and the capitalist is defined by the exclusion of those resources from the worker, down to the very fact that these people meet at all, that they enter into relations of production at all, regardless of what those relations are. But that the worker ever even comes into contact with the capitalist is by the simple fact that the capitalist has property, that the capitalist controls property, and that the capitalist therefore is able to exclude from the worker that which then they need to go and enter into relations with the capitalist to acquire or to receive. So I think that's the brunt of the argument to be made, is that really essentially when you think about property, they are the social relations. And this goes back even when you talk about earlier forms of property. So again, just referring to earlier communal or public forms of property, they're sort of property in the juridical sense in terms of how it is legally structured and even legally phrased, is essentially the most abstract and important relations of production. So it's not the minutia of how you relate to your coworkers. It's how production proceeds at all, right? The fact that you relate to your coworkers in one way or the other is a fact that you've already come together in production, right? But why have you even come together in production? What has been the impetus for you to interact or associate with these people in any way, shape, or form? And the only way in which that can be analyzed is through, in my view, the exclusion or the inclusion of the use of particular materials or particular goods that society has produced. I mean, unless there's no social relation at all, unless everyone's just an individual producer working on their own, they enter into definite relations with other people, and those are ultimately defined by the property, or I don't even want to say defined by the property relations. It's not the appropriate way to look at it. The property relation is a formalization of those relations. The relations precede the juridical sort of property form, which then gets legalized and given certain legal precedent, etc. And, that returns back to the base and superstructure argument. And it's true that the superstructure does influence the base. So bourgeois private property as a legally defined property, title property, really is established out of new social relations that developed prior to that legalization of that property. And what Marx's point is with respect to revolutionary activity is that those new social relations form first. So the relationship of needing to find work came into effect. So having to sell your labor power in exchange for a wage and then go out and purchase commodities. This began to take root and establish itself prior to the actual recognition of title property in this sense. It wasn't as if people were like, oh, we're not allowed to do this under law, so, we don't do it, and we just fight and get the law changed, and then once the law changed, we do it, and yay, capitalism. No, what happened is you had a whole class of people that were beginning to enter, or two classes of people, or one class creating another class, that started to enter into these specific relations prior to the recognition of sort of full bourgeois title property as we know it. And it was only once those new relations came into significant enough contradiction with the current superstructure. So the material conditions changed the actual productive relations, or the relations of production, and then the relations of production essentially are the underlying component of the new property relations, which then no longer make sense in the old legal framework. So the entire sort of legal and social institutions which have developed in the at the superstructure level come into conflict with the base and the material conditions and the relations of productions as they actually exist. And the same will be true of any development away from capitalism. So it's required essentially that in order to realize socialism, we need to see this change in material conditions that produces a change in the relations of production, and those relations of production need to become increasingly dominant in order to increase the class antagonisms and eventually result in an overthrow of the old superstructure, of the old political order, of the economic order that exists today, and then to revolutionize the entire social experience, so to speak. So I hope that makes sense. I think so. Again, I would question it is, can you think of a way to even separate the two? Can you think of a way to say that the relationship between a capitalist and a worker is not already assuming bourgeois property, right? Bourgeois property is just a formalization of that relationship. But it has to be the case. It has to be the case that the worker is excluded from capital. It has to be the case that the worker is excluded from the productive forces. It has to be the case that they are required to enter into productive relations by selling their wage labor in order to talk about private property. And you could say that private property, there's a difference between private property being the actual social relation at that sort of base level versus the social or versus the juridical or legal expression. I tend to think Marx was actually more concerned with the latter, or not so much more concerned with the latter, that he used private property more so to refer to the latter, not as much to the base. I don't know if that made sense. So let me know if that makes sense as an answer. And if it doesn't, I don't know what else you would think property is aside from a social relation. To me, it's obvious that at the most abstract level, it's necessary the exclusion of another person. So it has to be a result of how people are interacting. I don't know. I want to move on just to the other questions that you've posed here. Very briefly. You say, is there anything in Marx's writings to indicate how he would have felt about Marxism-Leninism? One, I think we should just abandon the phrase Marxism-Leninism. Call it what it is. It's Stalinism. That is, no, I don't think any quote-unquote Leninist has ever referred to themselves as a Marxist-Leninist unless they're talking about really the political and social analysis of Stalin. But you say, is there anything in Marx's writing to indicate how he would have felt about it? Yeah, I think so. I think it's pretty clear from Marx's position in Critique of the Gotha Program. In fact, I think you should probably just read all of Critique of the Gotha Program to understand how Marx viewed the relation of really a revolutionary movement and a workers' party and the proletariat organized as a class as a whole in relation to things like state power and in relation to distribution of goods or rights to distribution of certain goods. He talks about the right to the Lassallean concept of right to labor undiminished. In questions like these, so there's questions with respect to how is labor structured in the USSR under Stalin, in the Stalinist era. Is labor wage labor in this period? Is there exploitation? Is there the production of surplus value? And I would say yes to all these things. And I think a lot of that is revealed in Critique of the Gotha Program. I think that, along with just general views about, again, very practical criticism in that work. Relation to the state, relation to education. He talks about how education should not be run by the state. To the extent that it is run by the state, it should essentially be purely a question of funding and administrative aspects, not in the sense of the state actually produces state curriculum, not in the sense of that the state is determining what people learn. The state is an administrative organ in Marx's view, essentially for the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's a political organ and it's an administrative organ, but it's first and foremost in terms of the economics. It's a question of administration. As a political organ, to me, that's the more interesting question that I think is more frequently raised by capitalist critics, or concerns are raised around that, that's where I think you would probably see less criticism or less ways, at least that Marx was could have been indicating how he would feel about such a thing, because I think Marx is pretty permissive with the state as a political organ when it comes to class conflict. There's points essentially where Marx argues with respect to and maybe this goes back to the question that I get asked about nonviolence, but there's points where Marx talks about the terror of revolutions, and he talks about that when it's our turn, we won't ask for justification or permission or something like that. There's Marx views, I think, he views the proletariat as requiring political supremacy in a very absolutist sense, but I think that's in contrast to that he understands the bourgeoisie having political supremacy in an absolute sense. And I think what is lost here is that if Marx viewed the bourgeoisie as having political supremacy in an absolute sense, then for the proletariat to have the same means that, the political institutions may not look any less liberal, so to speak, than bourgeois political institutions. I would argue that they would actually be more free, that they would be less repressive, less oppressive. But there's no reason to think that they should be more so than the bourgeoisie, because he was contrasting, or rather comparing, the requisite political power or expression of power by the proletariat to the bourgeoisie. So, using the phrase dictatorship of the proletariat is not distinctly different from what Marx viewed capitalism as, which was, as a state society, it's a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. So maybe that clarifies that. So I think on the political matters, less so, or rather, there's less that would have been an indictment of Marxism-Leninism on political matters. On economic or administrative or sort of social structuring of society matters, I think there's significant places where there would have been an indictment, and just overall indictment on the relationship to the state in general. I think the quote from Critique of the Gotha Program that most readily comes to mind is when he's talking about the use of the phrase free state, and he says, free state, what is this? Essentially that the people are more free, so to speak, the less free the state is. It's a really terrible paraphrasing. Just go and read the quote. Look up Critique of the Gotha Program, free state. Lastly, you say, if this is even possible to answer, do you think Marx would have changed his mind about anything if he could have today's historical perspective? Rise and fall of the USSR, Western Europe as social democracies with a high standard of living, the as of yet undelivered international workers' revolution. No. It's not so much that I think Marx would have changed his mind about anything. He probably would have, but it's tough to understand what you mean about that. The thing with Marxism, Marx's analysis and analytical process and his theories and the whole lot of it is that they were built from having historical perspective. They were derived from historical perspective. So they essentially encompass whatever developments actually occur in history. This isn't to say that people would always reach the same conclusions, but so the question is, would Marx come to conclusions, I guess, that differed from conclusions he came to in other circumstances? And superficially, that may appear to be the case, but that would only be because the history was particularly different. I would speak particularly, on the question of the USSR. I think one of the bigger discussions or debates or maybe even disagreements between people is, how important is the development of material conditions with the ability to develop socialism, or with the essential necessity to build socialism. Is there a point where material conditions become so advanced that really revolution is just a matter of there's no way society can function anymore? People are the relations of production have changed so much that it just the current law doesn't make sense. It's non-applicable. The state is just becoming this massive, oppressive organ that tries to force people into a very conservative, old school way of doing things when modern relations no longer reflect that. And I think that's possible to occur. I think that's, historically how revolutions have developed. I mean, it's important too, when you think about revolutions, not to think about them as these like very pinpointed parts of history. I think we do in Western history, we talk about revolutions as essentially wars, right? It's a revolutionary war that is the revolution. Whereas I think Marx's view of revolution was quite a bit grander than this. So I think his position was essentially that, the revolution was a continuing sort of development over time. And, I would say that bourgeois revolutions as a whole, you're talking potentially spans of hundreds of years, 200 years probably at a minimum. And those revolutions, even in the United States, encompass things. So I would actually say you have to go all the way back to England with the question of the English Civil War. Once you have the English Civil War, then obviously, 100 years and some decades later, you're getting the U.S. Revolutionary War, not the English Civil War. That's not what I'm thinking of. English Civil War, I think, was like 15 something. I'm thinking 1640. No, that's right. That sounds right. Yeah, so but let's say it's 150 years at most. And then you have U.S. Revolutionary War. And then I would say that goes all the way up to the Civil War, and arguably even past the Civil War, because even though the Civil War ends with your Emancipation Proclamation, we don't really see the complete abolition of slavery within the U.S., I would say. And even today, one can argue, although it's not as significant a percentage of the labor populace, slavery has yet to be abolished with respect to prison labor. Anyone convicted can still be enslaved. So I think it's important to realize that these changing relations, so, slavery is not a natural fit. That is, chattel slavery is not a natural fit for capitalism. But yeah, so I think with the USSR, there's this question of whether or not material development is required to take the USSR or enable the USSR to become a socialist society. And I think this is a problem with a certain level of materialistic determinism that is common among certain strains of Marxism. I don't think the USSR's problem was not material development. And if it was, that wasn't revealed to be the case, or that wasn't given a chance to be revealed to be the case. The USSR's problem was predominantly that the Bolsheviks made significant problematic decisions early on in the development of the revolution, and early on once they consolidated power. Chief among them being the involvement of bourgeois class within the trust, the revoking essentially of Soviet power, but just the installment overall of these sort of bourgeois technocrats into the trust, and then an open admission to sort of warranting state capitalism, this sort of one step back, two steps forward approach is just mind-boggling given the criticism, particularly of what became the left communists at the time. And I think my favorite critic of that is by far probably Osinski, who makes a point at one point. I think it's I don't remember which Congress it's in, but his statement basically reads, that, essentially all economic power has to be turned to the workers. If the workers can't build socialism, then it is not possible to build socialism, and it's not going to be possible for the state apparatus to build socialism. And he gets into this point of, that the concerns of the state, the more the party merges with the state, the concerns of the state are significantly different from the concerns of the proletariat as a class. They're actually antagonistic, right? The state is an institution which is designed to suppress class antagonisms, right? It's designed to use the power of one class to be able to essentially keep in control another class, and that could be through carrot or stick. But the point is to suppress class antagonisms as much as possible, so they're not constantly bubbling up into these revolutionary movements. And so long as you have class distinctions at all within Russia, the more that the Bolsheviks merge with the state, the more their concern is to suppress class antagonisms, not to draw them out. Whereas the proletariat as a class is concerned with expressing its class interests and its class power, and therefore would increase class antagonisms. And that's a messy thing, but that is what was necessary. And that is what needed to be done. And it was only by the increased suppression of the proletariat as a class and of the working masses that I think the USSR, or the Russian Revolution more particularly, was unsuccessful in developing socialism. Because I think by and large it was there. By and large, I don't think material conditions were the significant factor. I think it was a very, very political suppression. So that's where I stand on the Russian Revolution. I will close with that, and thank you for listening.